Behaviorism and the unconscious. Behaviorism is a school of thought in psychology that focuses on observable behaviors rather than internal mental states. In the early 20th century, behaviorism became one of the most dominant perspectives in psychology, largely because it provided a clear, measurable approach to studying human behavior. The idea behind behaviorism is simple: all behaviors are learned through interaction with the environment, and these behaviors can be shaped, modified, and controlled through reinforcement and punishment. One of the major figures in behaviorism is John B. Watson, who argued that psychology should focus solely on observable behaviors and not on what goes on inside the mind. Watson believed that behaviors are not influenced by unconscious processes but are simply responses to stimuli in the environment. This was a major departure from earlier psychological theories that focused heavily on the unconscious, such as those proposed by Sigmund Freud. Freud's theory emphasized the idea that our behaviors are largely driven by unconscious desires, memories, and conflicts. According to Freud, much of what we do is motivated by parts of the mind we are not even aware of. In contrast, behaviorists like Watson and later B.F. Skinner believed that all behavior is learned through conditioning and that the unconscious mind is not necessary to explain behavior. There are two main types of conditioning that behaviorists study: classical conditioning and operant conditioning. Classical conditioning was first demonstrated by Ivan Pavlov, a Russian physiologist. Pavlov found that dogs could be trained to associate the sound of a bell with food. Over time, the dogs would salivate when they heard the bell, even if no food was presented. This process, where a neutral stimulus becomes associated with a response, is at the core of classical conditioning. Operant conditioning, championed by B.F. Skinner, is based on the idea that behavior can be shaped by rewards and punishments. If a behavior is followed by a reward, it is more likely to be repeated in the future. If a behavior is followed by a punishment, it is less likely to occur. Skinner conducted many experiments on animals, particularly rats and pigeons, to demonstrate how behavior could be controlled through reinforcement. He developed the idea of the Skinner box, where animals would press a lever to receive food, showing that behavior could be shaped by manipulating environmental consequences. The central belief of behaviorism is that everything we do is learned from our interactions with the environment. For example, if a child is rewarded for good behavior, they will be more likely to repeat that behavior. If a child is punished for misbehavior, they are less likely to engage in that behavior again. This focus on external influences makes behaviorism a very different approach compared to theories that emphasize internal mental processes like thoughts, feelings, or the unconscious. Now, let's talk about the unconscious in the context of behaviorism. For behaviorists, the unconscious mind, as described by Freud and other psychoanalysts, does not play a role in explaining behavior. Behaviorism argues that everything we need to know about human behavior can be observed from the outside. In other words, we don't need to look inside the mind or delve into unconscious processes to understand why people do what they do. Behaviorists believe that behavior is shaped by the environment and that unconscious thoughts or motivations are irrelevant. However, this does not mean that behaviorists completely ignore the idea that some of our behaviors happen automatically, without conscious thought. For example, when we touch something hot, we quickly pull our hand away without thinking. This kind of reflexive behavior is automatic, but behaviorists would argue that it is still a learned response rather than something driven by the unconscious. Even complex behaviors that seem to happen without conscious thought, like habits or routines, are viewed by behaviorists as learned responses to the environment rather than expressions of unconscious desires. Behaviorism's rejection of the unconscious has been one of the key points of criticism from other psychological perspectives. Cognitive psychologists, for example, argue that internal mental processes such as thinking, memory, and decision-making are crucial to understanding behavior. Cognitive psychologists acknowledge that while behavior can be influenced by external factors, our internal thoughts and unconscious processes also play a significant role in shaping how we act. Similarly, humanistic psychologists criticize behaviorism for oversimplifying human behavior. They argue that behaviorism doesn't account for the complexity of human motivation, emotions, and self-awareness. Humanistic psychology focuses more on personal growth, self-actualization, and the importance of subjective experiences, which behaviorism tends to overlook. In modern psychology, most researchers agree that both external factors, as emphasized by behaviorism, and internal mental processes, such as unconscious thoughts, are important for understanding behavior. While behaviorism laid the foundation for much of psychology's focus on observable, measurable phenomena, contemporary psychology integrates insights from many different perspectives, including cognitive, psychoanalytic, and humanistic approaches. One key concept where behaviorism and the idea of the unconscious might intersect is in the area of implicit learning. Implicit learning refers to learning that happens without conscious awareness. For instance, when we learn to ride a bike, we eventually become able to do so without consciously thinking about it. While behaviorists would argue that this is simply a learned behavior reinforced by practice and repetition, others might say that there are unconscious processes at work that help us perform the task. In conclusion, behaviorism and the unconscious represent two very different ways of understanding human behavior. Behaviorism focuses on observable actions and external stimuli, emphasizing that all behavior is learned from the environment. In contrast, theories that include the unconscious suggest that our behavior is influenced by internal processes that we are not always aware of. While behaviorism has contributed a great deal to our understanding of learning and conditioning, modern psychology recognizes that behavior is complex and influenced by both external and internal factors. The debate between behaviorism and the unconscious mind continues to be an important discussion in the field of psychology.